I can honestly say, without a shadow of a doubt, this is the furthest I have ever travelled to give a talk. I left home around Thursday lunchtime, and Gary collected me from Canberra Airport at Saturday lunchtime. And frankly, I had no idea where I was, far less in the capital of Australia. But it is lovely. All the way over, I was thinking on the plane about the possibilities that could intervene that would mean that I wouldn't actually make it here, because I thought it was quite a realistic possibility, one way or another. But I was reminded, as I often am, of an experience of a very good friend of mine. A couple of years ago now, he was at his desk at Glasgow University. I won't name him, in case any of this ever leaks out. You'll get what I mean in a minute. He was at his desk and he took a call from someone I'll describe as our mutual acquaintance, who said, "Would you like to be the keynote speaker at a history conference I'm organising in the National Army Museum in London?" And my very good friend said, "Oh, that would be an honour and a privilege. Of course I'll do that." Conversation drew to a close. My good friend put the phone down, and he'll freely admit now that for reasons he can't explain, he's never done it before and hasn't done it since, he didn't write anything down after the conversation. And to cut a long story short, he completely forgot. It was months later that the fateful day finally came, and he was at the cinema with his wife. They had enjoyed the film and they were walking back through the foyer, and his mobile phone rang. And he answered it, oblivious, not a care in the world, to hear our mutual acquaintance say, "Oh, thank goodness I've reached you. I'm assuming you're in the building. You're on in 15 minutes. The conference is in London, my friend's in Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow." The blood drains from his face. His wife thinks he's taken some kind of dreadful news. And realising that the situation was utterly irredeemable, that there was nothing that he could say to make the situation any better, he heard himself saying, "Andy, I'm so sorry. I'm in the hospital. My mother's had a stroke." So, such are the trials and tribulations of public speakers. The theme, as it was explained to me that I should address while I'm speaking to you, it boils down to how we go about making history relevant in a world in which we're bombarded by an ever-present now, a constant deluge of information about the now. So how do we go about making everyone, not just students, but all of us, consider the relevance of history? And it's frankly such a huge question, and it's something that I think about on a daily basis. But on arrival here in Australia, and looking at the newspapers, I was struck by one headline in particular that seemed to suggest that in many ways we don't actually have a problem. And it was the story about the possibility of the government feeling the need to intervene and hold a ballot to decide who can attend the Anzac Memorial in Gallipoli in 2015. Now, I'm not going to address the rights and wrongs of whether any government should be intervening in people's activities in that way. What I would say, though, is the fact that nearly 100 years after that event, the fact that a government has to be thinking about limiting numbers of people attending it is surely encouraging. Apart from anything else, it shows the way in which an event from 100 years ago is still so relevant in people's lives. And I know from the work that I do in relation to the Great War that increasingly the people who are turning up at Tyne-Court and the other great memorials in France, turning up at the battlefields in Gallipoli and in the Western Front, are young people, students straight out of school and straight out of university. And I think it addresses the issue head on, the fact that people feel this connection to the past. I've been doing quite a lot of work recently. I'm making a film at the moment about the experience of some Skye men from the island of Skye, who volunteered for the territorial regiments and found their way to the Battle of Festubert in 1915, just outside the city of Lille. But in making the film, I've obviously been looking at the broader picture of the Great War, and it's no wonder that it still resonates with us today. One terrifying statistic that I ran across, the the German attack into France in 1914 was supposed to be very quick, and it was supposed to encircle Paris and draw the whole thing to a close. But that wasn't to be the case, and the French, with their British allies, brought the Germans to a standstill at the Battle of the Marne in November 1914. And that was when everyone dug in and the war took on the terrifying character that it had. By the end of the Battle of the Marne, the French had lost 1 million casualties. So with 4 years of the war still to fight, they were 1 million men down. 3/4 of them were dead, and the rest would never fight again. And I think about in Britain, when we hear reports of casualties from Afghanistan and Iraq, battles that are going on just now, we're rightly horrified when we get news of a single death, or 2 or 3 perhaps happening at the same time. And I think about what it must have done to societies 100 years ago to start getting the news of 1 million citizens of your own country dead after 4 months of fighting. So it's no wonder that we remain preoccupied, and that the history of those events will always be relevant for us. Matilda mentioned in her remarks Cheddar Gorge. And I hadn't been thinking about Cheddar Gorge for quite some time, but she brought it all back for me, the work that I've done in the past, which again shows the way in which history is ever present, even ancient history. Cheddar Gorge was where archaeologists found what is still the oldest complete human burial found so far anywhere in the British Isles. The individual that was excavated in Cheddar Gorge was found to be something of the order of 9,000 years old. So distant, you would say, so utterly lost to us. Perhaps you might describe him as irrelevant to the modern day, but scientists collected DNA from the bones of Cheddar Man, as he's known, and compared it with DNA collected from people living in the vicinity today. And they found the closest tie, the closest possible match between Cheddar Man, 9,000 years old, and a history teacher working in the local school. How fitting, you would say. But the fact is, what it does for me is it suddenly collapses the distance. 9,000 years is an impossible time frame to get your head around. But to realise that someone living and teaching history 20 miles from the site of the discovery of that body, to find that connection means that for a brief moment, the 9,000 years just disappear. It was mentioned again in the introduction, I'm routinely described nowadays as a historian. But I've got news for you, I'm not. I'm not a historian. I'm really an archaeologist. I've become known as a historian. I can tell you briefly why that is. In about 2004, 2005, I was approached about a new series that someone had thought up called Coast, and they were looking for people to take part. And they said, would you come along and see if you'd like to make a contribution to the project? And of course, I leapt at the chance. And eventually, I sort of made it through what you would call the auditioning period for it, and I was going to be part of the team. And I got a phone call from a BBC researcher sometime just not long after saying, we'd like you to be part of the team. Can we call you a historian? And I said, well, I'm not a historian. And the researcher said, it's all right, because when we put your name up on the screen and put the word historian underneath it, everyone will think you're a historian. That's how I became a historian. Yeah, so there we are. That's how I became a historian. And I am, in fact, an archaeologist. That was my first love. Gay was mentioning her affection for the whole subject of archaeology. I get quite a lot of mail addressed to me. Some of it you might describe as fan mail, but a lot of it is people asking questions about subjects that they've seen me talking about on television. And a genuinely pleasing amount of it comes addressed to Professor Neil Oliver, which, needless to say, I am not. I did recently, a couple of years ago, I was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Abertay in Dundee, which means that with my initials, I am Dr. No. Now, there's a lifetime's ambition realised. So making history relevant. So as an archaeologist, my preoccupation, as I think Gay was suggesting, my preoccupation is with the extreme past. Because I realised history was my best subject at school. I was not, and I would never claim to be the best student. I was an okay student, and I got an okay degree. But history was my best subject at school. But I realised when it came time to think about choosing a subject to pursue at university, that I wanted to go further back. It seemed to me that the story of humankind, could be considered as a book, and that the history that I had been studying at school felt a bit like picking up the book and opening it to pages actually quite near the end, because I was aware that so much more had happened to fill up the deep time before the advent of what we would regard as recorded history. And it was that desire to, in my teenage imagination, to start the book at page 1 that I chose not to study history at university, not to continue with the subject I'd had most success with at school, but to go for an opportunity to go into deep time. And I can honestly say that archaeology did become a kind of a love affair for me. I was utterly besotted with the subject. But really, I don't make any practical distinction between archaeology and history. To me, it's just all about the study of people. I think to be a historian or a history teacher, or just simply someone who's interested in history, it boils down to really nothing more, I would say, than an interest in people, downright nosiness, in fact. And archaeology can be described as picking through the rubbish. Historians concentrate on the written word, diaries, documents, letters, anything that's been written by people. Archaeologists operate in a period before the written word, and so look at and reconstruct past lives by considering the material remains, the things left behind. And as I say, it is really synonymous with picking through the rubbish bags, because you're looking at the things that people leave behind, either deliberately or inadvertently, and you try to piece together the story of the past from that detritus. But the reason that the archaeology, or the study of the past, really captured me and continues to capture me is the enormity of the subject and the huge frame of time that we're dealing with. And as history teachers, I'm sure you sometimes realize that the biggest challenge is thinking where to start, because everything is history. Everything that happened before this moment is history. And you think, where do I identify page 1, and how do I start the story logically? The universe is 14 million years old. Planet Earth is 14 billion years old, sorry. Planet Earth is 5 billion years old, or 6,000 years, depending on which book you read. Big swing there. There have been human beings of a kind, not us, but quite like us, for several millions of years, and our species is something like 200,000 years old. And it means that, to me, before the advent of people like us, or more or less like us, there was no meaningful time in the universe. Until we came along, nobody was paying any meaningful attention to the passage of time. And as far as we know, we are the first creatures to have felt the unbearable weight of time, the unbearable weight of infinity. We are the first to remember and to mourn. So time, in a sense, starts with us. We are enslaved by it. We are held in servitude to it. And history, therefore, starts with us as well. We're the first people to have, or the first creatures to have bothered to think about what came before, and from that point to have then begun recording events as they unfold. And this recording of events is part service to the future, and it's also in part vanity, because in addition to handing on to our descendants the backstory that will give context to their present, I think we have to confess that we also want to be remembered in that future, to have been noticed, either as individuals or collectively, and to have mattered. So remembering, memory, history, these are uniquely human. History is an instinct. We are Earth's youngest apes. We're feeble. We're without claws or fangs. We are without speed or strength. We are naked of feather or fur. And yet, beneath thin caps of bone, we're possessed of brains that look backwards and forwards in time. And this is a predicament, because alone in the universe, we worry about when and what happened then. And it's that sense of the enormity of history that appeals to me. It was brought home to me on a project that I'm not sure if the television series played here. It was called The Last Explorers. And it was about following in the footsteps of 4 Scottish pioneers, 4 men who went to different corners of the globe and changed the places that they touched forever. We followed David Livingstone into Africa, Thomas Blake Glover into Japan. He was a man who helped to open Japan up to the West after centuries of exclusion for Japan. We followed William Spears Bruce to Antarctica. Before the coming of Scott and Shackleton, William Spears Bruce was Britain's premier polar explorer. And we followed John Muir to California. John Muir was born in Dunbar, east of Edinburgh, and he was the son of a father who could really only be described as a religious fundamentalist. He was a man who looked around, this is John Muir's father, was a man who looked around Dunbar and saw it as representing the depths of depravity and a lack of faith and people not observing Christianity as he understood it. And so he took the whole family, John Muir included, to the eastern seaboard of the United States and made a new home for them there. And when John Muir grew up, he had an accident at work which blinded him temporarily. And when he got his sight back, he decided that for as long as his sight lasted, and as it happens, his sight never left him again, but he was worried that it would, and he endeavoured to ensure that for as long as he had vision, he would see as much as he possibly could of his world. And so he embarked on a 1,000-mile march, a 1,000-mile walk, to see everything that he could see. And his wanderings brought him eventually to California and to the valley that we know as Yosemite. I've brought a good old-fashioned Scottish cold with me. You have to excuse me. So it brought him to Yosemite, and there, amongst other things, he encountered the sequoia trees. And the sequoia trees utterly captivated him, as they would anyone, the giant redwoods, as they would anyone that sees them. And when he encountered the sequoias, they were actually, the Americans in California at that time were in the process of cutting them down because they're enormous, and they thought that they would be a wonderful source of lumber. But in fact, it proved to be a pointless exercise. The nature of the sequoia means that when the tree is felled, the impact on the ground means that the wood just shatters into matchwood. So it's useless. It doesn't even burn because it's so rich in tannins that protect it from forest fire. So you can't even use it for firewood. But it was the efforts of John Muir, really, in the vanguard, other supporters who prevented the harvesting of the sequoia. And it's the fact that any of them survive into the modern era is down to the stubbornness, in large part, of one Scotsman. But, yeah, Scottish. I'm Scottish, you might have noticed. But we climbed on the sequoias. We were with tree scientists, and we were given the opportunity to go up them on ropes, a truly terrifying experience. And we climbed one which is known as the Great Bonsai. It's a little joke there, a little tree scientist joke. It's not by any means the tallest of the sequoias. It's well over 200 feet tall, but the tallest of them are in excess of 300 feet high. The wonder of the Great Bonsai is in the sheer bulk of timber that it contains. It is, in terms of its girth, and in terms of the scale of the branches that grow from it, the branches are bigger than fully grown trees of other species growing nearby. And Great Bonsai would just about fit between these two pillars, possibly less. It is arguably one of the largest trees, and therefore one of the largest living things on planet Earth. And when you're in its shadow, you feel it. You feel the presence. Now, there's no doubting that the largest and the oldest of the sequoia trees are something like 2,000 years old. Now that's miraculous in itself. I mean, that means that there's a living tree in the high Sierras of Western California that's as old as Christianity. That, you're talking about 200 generations of empires and kingdoms rising and falling while one tree grows. But some of the scientists will admit that there's really no way to calculate how old the trees really are. The only way that you can do it accurately is to cut them down and count the rings. And no one is suggesting doing that with any of the giants. And in any case, it's futile because usually the internal core of the tree is rotten. So the ring counting project would be inconclusive at best and meaningless at worst. But they will speculate that there's a very strong possibility that trees like the great bonsai are as much as 4,000 years old, which I find breathtaking. That means that when the finishing touches were being put to Stonehenge and Avebury in the south of England, and when people in Britain were working with bronze tools, great bonsai was growing in the western Sierras of California. And for me, an encounter with a living organism like great bonsai, rather than making you think about the length of human history, it reminds you, in fact, how relatively brief human history has been. The sequoias have been growing. They used to grow all over the planet. They gradually lost their domain and were whittled back until they only grow now in Western California. But 200 million years ago, in the Jurassic period, the sequoias were spread across the planet. Our species, as I mentioned earlier, is about 200,000 years old, which means that the giant redwoods, the sequoias, have been here 1,000 times as long. And it means that our history as human beings is the very definition of brief. In terms of the lifespan of the planet that we squat upon, in many respects, our tenure has been no more significant than this year's crop of mosquitoes. We are just briefly here. And one of the things I would say about making history matter to people is that, in a way, you have to think that our history has been, in terms of a 5 million year old planet, is still just a spark of light. It's just been a flash. It's as bright and as potentially powerful as a flash of inspiration, but it's also been as brief. And the fact is that our history as a species only matters to us. And if things go wrong, and if we bring about our own extinction, our history will disappear when the last of us closes our eyes. It matters and is significant only to us. There's a wonderful book by an American science writer and journalist called Alan Weisman called A World Without Us. And he imagines what would happen were the apocalypse to come and the human race was suddenly to be gone from the planet. And within a few years, the roads and the motorways are turned green as grass and other plants sprout through them. The cities are engulfed by forest. Rivers running through the tunnels underneath the cities gradually bring the buildings down. Everything is returned to nature in a relatively brief span, a few centuries. The last things to go would be the plastic bags and the nuclear waste. Even the twisted copper wires of our telecommunications and the iron and steel pipes that carry the water, they would be crushed by geology back into metal veins running through the rock. Everything is cleared away. But long before that happens, every last hard drive, every last CD and DVD, every last book will be dust on the wind. And so I think one of the significant things that motivates me is the fact that our history is something that we have to cherish and look after, because nobody else cares about us on the planet except us. And it's our duty to inspire the coming generations about the significance of all of this. The other problem that goes with that, I would say, is that we are, as a species, are not really designed to remember. The French philosopher Henri Bergson said, it's the function of the brain to enable us not to remember, but to forget. And I love that thought. It's the function of the brain to enable us not to remember, but to forget. Because if you think about it, when you're going through your daily experience, your brain is being deluged with data and information, and your brain is working all the time, frankly, to get rid of almost everything and to retain just a tiny percentage of a percentage of a percentage of everything that you see and experience every day. It's an act of forgetting. So you have to make a positive effort to remember and to record. And I'm always fascinated, actually, that you can all do it. If you think back and consider your own memories, some of them seem so very random. You think about vivid memories that you have from childhood and others, and they're not always of moments of great pith and significance. It's as if your brain operates like some kind of randomly operated camera that's running all the time, but just on a whim, it seems, the shutter comes down and it takes a snapshot of a moment, and that becomes a memory. Memory's been effectively described as being like a dog that lies down where it pleases, that there's just this uncontrolled aspect of what we remember. And so we have to be very careful to make sure that history, as we record it and retell it, is meaningful. And it's a very difficult journalistic exercise. So for me, I mentioned that history was my favourite subject, my best subject. And what did it for me really was the fact that very early in my life, history became personal. I think it's too easy to think that history is something that happened to other people a long time ago, and that in some way it's not connected to our own story. But by luck or good judgment, I found out very early on that I am connected to history, but not in any spectacular way, just in an everyday way that I'm sure everyone in this room could empathise with. I sort of realised that there was an open door connecting me to world history when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and my dad started to tell me about how both of my grandfathers had fought in but survived the First World War. And of course, as a 5-year-old, that was meaningless. What was meaningful, though, was that my mum's dad, he was James Cameron Neal. That's my mum's maiden name, and that's why I'm called Neil. That's a little bit of history there. He was at Gallipoli. The details of it, as they are for so many servicemen of the First World War, are very sketchy. But he had a very sad childhood, my grandfather, who I never met, who was dead long before I was born. His mother died giving birth to him. And in a spectacular illustration of the morbid nature of the Victorian world into which he was born, he was christened over his mother's coffin. Now there's a spectacle that you wouldn't expect to see in the modern day. His father remarried, and it was a happy marriage, but the stepmother didn't like the children of the first marriage. And so at the earliest opportunity, aged about 17, my grandfather decided to leap at the opportunity of signing up for the First World War. He lied about his age. We think he joined the Marines, but we're not quite sure. But in any event, he found his way to Gallipoli, and how it came to pass, we're not sure, but he was with 2 other soldiers, and they were coming back into their own encampment, and the sentry, their own sentry, was drunk, and he opened fire on the 3 soldiers. The 2 men that my grandfather was with, I mean, remember, my grandfather's 17, 18 years old at this point. The 2 men with him are killed outright, and a bullet passed through my grandfather's body, entering this arm, through his body, and then lodging in this arm, from which it was removed. My grandfather was invalided out of Gallipoli and invalided back to Britain, aged about 18 years old. His war was over. And he died in his early 50s from really complications attributed to wounds that were never properly treated and that never properly healed. My dad's dad was alive in my lifetime, Robert Miller Oliver. I like to remember the names, but I mean, just when I think about it, how many of you in here could name the first name of one of your great-grandparents? And I wonder, I was just thinking that that's a huge number. I think if I asked that in an auditorium back in Scotland, many fewer hands would go up. And I wonder if it's a consequence of a young country and people being maybe more aware here in Australia of their genealogies than maybe elsewhere. But I don't know, that's something to be considered at another place and time. My dad's dad was in the French theatre of war, and he was wounded twice. Once with a shell that exploded somewhere near him, and a lump of shrapnel lodged behind his ear, behind his left ear. And he was brought back home to the southwest of Scotland to be treated. He had other injuries as well. But this piece of shrapnel, either the surgeons could not or would not remove it, and so it remained. And if I sat on his knee and rubbed a finger behind his ear, as a small boy, obviously, talking a 5-year-old here, wasn't something I did when I was a teenager. I could feel this edge under the skin. It was like touching the kind of blunt edge of a bread knife under the skin. And it was this that I found one day, and it was this that I asked my dad about, because my grandpa wouldn't tell me what it was. My dad said, "Oh, that's a bit of a shell fragment." And then the story started to come. And my grandfather also had a wound in this arm. He had a scar. We think it was from another explosion. A puckered circular scar on his forearm, and he called it his clock, because it was circular and it had lines coming off of it that suggested a clock face. But more significantly, the damage to his tendons had shut these 2 fingers against the palm of his hand forever, like pulled them tight. And it looked as though he was holding a coin against his palm, but it was an involuntary fixed position. And so Grandpa became doubly fascinating to me as a small boy, because not only did he have a bomb fragment in his head, his hand was the same as my Action Man. As any owner of a Mark I Action Man will tell you, the right hand was shaped to fit into the trigger guard of the little plastic Lee Enfield rifle that it came with. And it made Grandpa a mystifying figure to me, because he was in his 70s when I was born, and 70 when I was 5 was a lot older than 70 is now. I tell myself, aged 46. But Grandpa was a little old, plump, white-haired man. He looked a bit like Private Godfrey from Dad's Army. And in fact, that was how I always pictured him in the First World War, because it was impossible for me to imagine Grandpa as the young man that he had been when he was actually taking part in that conflict. But that is why it was that realization when I went to school and began to hear about the Great War. I felt a connection to it, because I thought, I own a bit of that because my grandfathers were there. And it also, very early on, it reminded me, I think one of the people making introductions was talking about, the ancestors. It might have been Matilda, talking about, that we are all, the survivors of history. And I realized that if the drunk sentry if the bullet had taken a slightly different trajectory, my grandfather would have died long before he had the opportunity to make my mother, who then made me. And likewise, if my dad's dad had been any closer to either of the 2 things that exploded close enough to him to hurt him, he would have been gone as well. And so, but for those 2 chance survivals, you would be listening to someone else talking here today, because I simply wouldn't exist. And I think everyone in this room has, whether you know it or not, we are all survivors of ancestors who, by luck or good judgment, survived events great and small. And one of the things that, if I was a history teacher, that I would try to transmit to people to engage them is the fact that whether they know it or not, history is their story. We're all survivors of all of it. 200,000 years of it. There's long lines that connect all of us back to people that walked out of Africa 50 or 60,000 years ago, and their descendants lasted through all this unimaginable expanse of time to make the people that we are. And that's also, I think, something that's important to get across, is the idea that because we don't know the names of our ancestors, it makes them no less significant. And the fact that they didn't do anything famous or remarkable except survive long enough to make the people who subsequently made us, they should be an object of veneration and fascination. And I think the Aboriginal people of Australia are much better at thinking that way about their ancestors than we are, because we live in this ever-present now. But again, I think it's important to remember the connections that go all the way back. It was Einstein who said, time only exists so that everything doesn't happen at once. If you look at it from a certain way, the fact that you're separated from events by 200,000 years is inconsequential. It's all, I feel when I'm telling stories to camera, when I'm talking to camera, I can't help but describe events of 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago as breaking news. I can't help but think of them as current. There's no difference for me between something that I read in the morning's newspaper and something that I know happened 10,000 years ago. It's no less significant. And I think the point of it is beautifully made by George Eliot in the end of Middlemarch, which she concludes with, and the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill for you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who faithfully lived a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. You know, hidden lives and unvisited tombs, I think, are worth remembering. That even though people think, there's nobody interesting in my family, I'm not connected to anything of any significance, they are. They just don't know what it is. I've been asked to consider the way in which decisions are made regarding how we put together a television series about history. And it's a challenge. One of the series that was mentioned was A History of Scotland, which was, it still stands out for me as my favourite thing. That was my favourite project that I've been involved with. If you look at the credits for the programme coming up, it's A History of Scotland, but we very carefully spelt history with a small h, because it was to underline the fact that it was a history of Scotland, not the history of Scotland, that it was an interpretation, that it was a group of people who had sat down and decided what should be the constituent elements of a history of Scotland. And it was an agonising process, because you're driven all the time by this desire to, on the one hand, mention enough familiar events and names that people won't feel excluded from the subject. They'll feel they've got some kind of handhold on an otherwise imposing edifice of history. But you also want to bring them things that they don't know, so that the thing is fresh. So there were a lot of discussions went on about what we should put in, what we should leave out. And I raised the subject then, and I'll raise it now, that you have to be very careful about what you think matters to people in history. And I can illustrate that because before I was involved in A History of Scotland, I did a much more modest production called Scotland's History, the Top 10. And it was a very simple thesis, if that's not too grandiose a word. The idea was that we would get a group of historians, like real historians, not people like me, and put them in a room and have them come up with what they thought were the 10 most important people and the 10 most important events in Scotland's history. I, meanwhile, would go out on the street with a camera crew and stop people and ask them, regular people like you and me. And we went to towns and cities all over Scotland, just barreling up to people on the pavement and stopping them and, asking them to take part in this. And of course, you're expecting to hear certain keywords, certain shibboleths like Bannockburn, Culloden, Alexander Graham Bell, Fleming and his penicillin. You're expecting to hear about Mary Queen of Scots, the Great War. There are all these things that you expect to hear. And we did, to be fair, hear those names mentioned quite a lot. But I can honestly say, and we had to be very careful about what we did with this in the finished item, every other person of a certain age, when asked what's the most important event in 10,000 years of Scotland's history, said Archie Gemmell's goal against Holland in the 1978 World Cup in Argentina. Now, you laugh. We laughed. But you can't tell people. You ask them a straight question, you get a straight answer. And if that is the thing that springs to that person's mind, you're suddenly brought face to face with what events really matter to people. The historians in the locked room, funnily enough, they never mentioned Archie Gemmell. But boy, did we have news for them. But A History of Scotland, it became and it is the television series of which I am most proud. And I'm sure some of it is a product of another point that I think is probably worth making. You have to actually stop me talking about history and archaeology because, and I say this without a hint of, I'm not making this up. It's about love for me. it's about love of the stories, it's about love of the people, and it's also about love of country. And, you can be as hard-faced about that as you want. And I'm not talking about nationalism or patriotism. I'm just talking about love of place, an appreciation of and a realization of the significance of the place in which you live. And I think that's another instinct that people have, and it's something that should be encouraged and brought out, because if you remind people that they have this innate love of place and country, then I think love of history naturally grows from it. There's a great line, there's a poem by an Irishman, actually, called Liam O'Flaherty, who grew up on the Aran Islands, tiny dots of rock off the west coast of Ireland, off Galway Bay. And he, in describing his homeland, said, "I was born on a storm-swept rock and hate the soft growth of sun-baked lands where there is no frost in men's bones." And as a Scot, living in the same latitude as Liam O'Flaherty, I can identify with that sentiment 100%. You live, well, not here in Canberra, right enough, but Australians live in a sun-baked land, without a doubt, where there is no frost in men's bones. And I came to Australia for the first time in January this year, and while I loved it, and I was immediately taken by it and fascinated by it, and began immediately to look forward to the next time that I would come here, little knowing that it would be in 3 months' time. But I realised that although I loved it and was fascinated by it and could spend a lot of time here, I am drawn to places that are storm-lashed and where there is frost in men's bones. And that's just a product of the atoms that I absorbed from the water and the things that I've eaten in Scotland have gone into me, before birth and in my lifetime. And there's an irresistible attraction to place for me. And I think, we should celebrate that. And so I think something that's important to unleash in people is to get them to admit how proud they are of country and place. And from that will grow love of country. One of my favourite aspects of telling the story of a history of Scotland was the Scottish Enlightenment. As it's called, it was a period around the end of the 18th century when Scotland's light burned brighter than at any other time in history. And walking the streets of Edinburgh at the same time, were people like Robert Burns, like David Hume, like Joseph Black, some of the greatest thinkers and scientists of the age, and they were all together at the same time, and it's gone down in history as the Enlightenment. And in fact, of that period, Voltaire, the French philosopher of such stature, at the time said, "It is to Scotland that we look for our idea of civilization." Imagine that. Imagine that. The country that produced Archie Gemmill. But it was because when I heard that third-party endorsement of my country 200 years later from a Frenchman saying that about my country, there's a friend of mine, a sound man that I work with quite a lot, who's a passionate Scotsman, and when we film outside Scotland, particularly when we film in London, in places, for example, like the British Museum, Francis likes to wear a T-shirt that has on it in large writing, "If it's not Scottish, it's crap." Which makes interviews with the curators in the British Museum very interesting. But it's that love of country. I was worried about this. I see that I'm sort of beginning to run out of time. I will conclude by saying that another aspect that you should be unashamed of when teaching history is the importance of adventure. I think there's nothing more that kids especially, but me still to this day, there's nothing better as an open door to history than tales of adventure. Because if you tell what appears to be an adventure story as the pill, you can slip as the jam rather. You can slip in pills of history that people won't notice that they're getting because they're being carried along by the momentum of the narrative. I got into television. I'll end at my beginning. I got into television because I was in another world. I was a journalist, and I was still doing things archaeological, and with a very good friend of mine, the friend who forgot the keynote speech, actually. We began a project in South Africa to excavate the battlefield of Isandlwana, which, if you've seen Zulu, hands up if you've seen Zulu, Michael Caine, Stanley Baker, greatest film ever made. Isandlwana is the battle in the morning before Rorke's Drift, when the British column are wiped out. And we went out to South Africa to excavate that battlefield. And we found all sorts of things of particular significance to us on the battlefield. We found a set of general service buttons, the buttons that fasten up one of those familiar red tunics of a British soldier's uniform, which was exciting enough because they were still in a row. And then underneath them were metal buttons from a shirt, the shirt that went underneath the tunic. And we thought that what we were beginning to excavate was human remains. We thought we were going to find a skeleton, but we didn't find any bones. There was no body there. What it was a tunic and a shirt that had been thrown aside. And you think, well, how does that happen in the heat of a battle? Well, the Zulu soldiers, the Zulu warriors, had lots of complicated rituals and traditions around fighting and killing. Fundamentally, killing was seen as unclean. And if you killed another human being, you became temporarily unclean. And it was the work of the Izinyangas, basically the regimental chaplains, to perform rituals after the battle to cleanse them. Because amongst other things, the Zulus believed, because they lived in a hot country, and they were familiar with what happens to dead bodies left in a hot country. They blow up, they bloat. And they believed that the bloating was caused by the soul of the dead person trapped inside, not being able to get out, which was why they were in the habit of disemboweling their victims, not as an act of mutilation, but to ensure that the soul could escape the dead body. And also, as part of the tradition, the man that they killed, if possible, they would take a bit of his clothing from him and wear it themselves until such times as the Izinyangas could perform the relevant cleansing rituals. So when the British came back in the aftermath and found all these stripped and, to their eyes, mutilated bodies, they thought that the Zulus had been just especially horrific, had committed war crimes, basically, but it was nothing to do with that. So what we had found with our buttons was where a Zulu soldier had killed, had stripped his victim, and had worn this item, and then had been subsequently cleansed by his Izinyanga and had taken it off and thrown it on the ground. And we, 100 years, 120 years later, we found this little evidence of a drama there on the ground. And it's when you read stories like that and you understand stories like that and you follow the story of Isandlwana, for example, in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, it's through something as emotive and as physical as buttons on the ground that opens the door into British policy in southern Africa at the back end of the 19th century. And you don't realise that that's what you're getting, but that's really what you're understanding. I wrote a book a few years ago called Amazing Tales for Making Men Out of Boys, which was all about the kind of tales of daring do and adventure and striving that I felt should be a part of every boy's and maybe every girl's education. And it was inspired in part by a poem by Robert Service called The Call of the Wild, which has within it, let us probe the silent places, let us seek what luck betide us, let us journey to a lonely land I know. There's a whisper on the night wind, there's a star agleam to guide us, and the wild is calling, calling, let us go. And that, the rhythm and the cadence and the emotion of that verse just puts the hairs up in the back of my neck. And I know that it's just something that I'm pre-programmed to be excited by. I'm overrunning. I'll conclude. History for me is a love affair. I am obsessed with it and can't hear enough about it. And one of my concerns is that I won't have long enough to learn enough as I go through the projects and the stories that I'm involved with. And it is all suffused with pride as well, because underlying it all is my satisfaction in knowing that my story and my family's story, and by extension all of your stories, are part of the bigger picture. In my case, it's part of the bigger picture of being part of Scotland. And for me, it's enough just to know that I belong. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.